if the map goes off, it's because it got too hot. But it's like you hear that fan running pretty loud. So hopefully it'll cool down. Huh? What? So, it's good to be with you tonight. And it's very tragic. We heard mentioned a moment ago in our prayer about our brethren over in Bremen who are grieving the loss of a precious child in a terrible accident. And certainly our hearts and prayers are with that church. I want to share with you also that I knew that Charles Lummis had cancer, prostate cancer, but come to find out that he also has lung cancer. And they're going to have to treat him for that as well. He doesn't know yet what kind or the extent of the treatment they're going to be offering him, but he'll know that hopefully in the next few weeks. Said that by the 1st of December they hope to know something about that. Also, Angela Tyson has asked that we all remember her in a special prayer this week as she travels to Texas to take care of the remains of her mother that passed away this week. And of course, her grandmother, Eula Stitcher, continues in the hospital in Carrollton. So I wanted to make you aware of that. Any news on Brother Gaddis? I know we mentioned him in our prayer. Anybody with an update on Brother Gaddis? Do you know anything about your father-in-law? You don't keep up with him, do you? Avoid him at all costs. What? That's probably true. I know he has shingle, but has it gotten any better or any improvement? I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, one of the things I want to do tonight, I was asked, where are we studying? All over the map, literally. But my biggest challenge tonight is going to be to governor my mouth. That is funny. When it came out, I don't know how that sounds. But I do. It wasn't that funny. I do want to try to slow down a little bit and not hurry through this. Because while we're doing this New Testament survey, I would like to help do more than just run through the books. I want to take a few moments as we go from book to book, illustrate how we can better appreciate these books, understand these books, glean the message from these books. So I don't want to rush through it. One of the things that will help us is visual. If you can visualize something when you're reading it, it certainly helps. If you can, when you're hearing about places and things, you can say, well, I know where that is, or there's some mental image that you can relate it to. It kind of brings it to life. And so when you're reading, for example, in the book of 2 Corinthians, which is what we're supposed to be studying tonight, but we're starting in Acts 18. And you may ask why, and I'll tell you in a minute, but when you think about understanding these different books, one of the things we have available to us is the book of Acts. It's kind of like a grid that we can put all these other pieces to, or attach these other pieces to. So when you think about these different books like 2 Corinthians, we're going to try to place it on that grid at some point that will help us to better appreciate and understand it. Now, something else I want to say in advance, and I touched on this a couple of weeks ago. We didn't have our class last week, the usual class anyway. So I want to kind of bring you back up to speed and refresh your memory on some things. But I'm going to try and defend a view of 2 Corinthians that's not held by everyone. And the reason I'm doing that is because I think I'm right and I think others are wrong. But it's more than that. It's a case of, in this matter, it doesn't make any difference. But as I go through making my defense, my hope is that I can at least enlighten you a little more and help you to see how you should and could look at different books of the Bible and appreciate a study of those books. So it's not just an exercise in futility. You may say, well, I don't agree with you. Well, that's okay. I think I have a pretty strong case to make of 4th or 5th Corinthians, depending on how we understand it, what we call 2nd Corinthians. But you may not agree with that, and that's okay. And it just goes to show that sometimes the historical setting that we accept for a book may or may not be accurate. But we have to be careful that whatever historical setting we put it in, that it allows us to have a reasonable interpretation of the text so that we can understand its message as originally given. In the case I'm going to be making tonight, 2 Corinthians, you could take the traditional view, I'll call it, that probably most of you would already have. I want to challenge that view. But you probably already have that view of 2 Corinthians, and I want to challenge that view. But even if you don't accept my view on it, it doesn't make any difference because the teaching that's found in 2 Corinthians isn't effective. And so I'm just going to stop making the case here, setting the stage, I should say, and start making my case, and maybe you'll understand where I'm coming from. Now, on the map, somebody said, I can't read the words. Well, that's too bad because that's pretty important to read the words. But you'll see these red lines. This represents Paul's 3rd missionary journey. Okay, I'm just using this map because we have on this map the locations that matter. Like, for example, what is this city right here? That is Jerusalem. And what city is this right here? That is Caesarea. Now, what city is this right here? Antioch. And then we come from, look, the line begins here at Antioch. Isn't that interesting? And on Sunday morning, Acts chapter 13, that's where we were this past Sunday, wasn't it? And that's where we stopped. We stopped right here on Sunday. Isn't that interesting how we're picking up right, almost like it's choreographed? So we're going to start in Acts 13. We're not going to read it, but that's where we were because the Holy Spirit said, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work that I've appointed them. So when they left, they came, well, this is not the first missionary journey. They went this way and came up this way and came back. So this is like a little loop they made on the first journey. This is the 3rd journey. But they all these journeys began, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd began right here in Antioch. Very important congregation. It was kind of the home base for Paul's work in this Mediterranean basin, we call it. And so, if you start here at Antioch, you come to Tarsus. Who was from Tarsus, by the way? Paul, Saul, who became Paul. Thank you. Now you come north, you got Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and Pisidia. You see this green section right here? What is this green section? That's a region. What is it? That's Galatia. This is the southern Galatian region. That's important. You hear in Bible class, Asia talked about a lot. This is that Asia. Notice in Asia we have Ephesus. Of course, you know from the book of Revelation, Smyrna, Sardis, Thyatira, Pergamos, Philadelphia, Hierapolis, Laodicea, Colossae. So these are important cities. There's Miletus. Paul met the elders there, remember? But here's Ephesus, very important place. Here's Troas, another very important place. Here is Philippi. This is the first time we come to, this is Europe, this way. We come to Philippi, and we have Thessalonica, and we have Berea. And then this is Macedonia. So the churches of Macedonia and the churches of Achaia. Now who's in Achaia? Well, we have Athens, Corinth, and then there's Cenchrea. And so we've got, these are important cities. You're not going to remember all those, but I want you to have some kind of visual guideposts when we go through this study. Question. When you read 2 Corinthians, is it simply a follow-up to 1 Corinthians? Most people say, yes, it is. And if that's your view, that's fine. That's wonderful. And there's nothing that I'm going to take issue with. There's no problem with you saying that. I don't believe that, but that's what most people say, that 2 Corinthians is simply the next of Paul's letters. Now, it is the next in the New Testament, yes. But you remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul referenced a letter to Corinth that we do not have. So we know that he wrote a letter to the church at Corinth that's not in the Bible. So the idea that he would write a letter that's not in the Bible to a church that he established is not far-fetched. It's actually established in 1 Corinthians 5. I want to make the case tonight that Paul wrote another letter between 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which would make 2nd Corinthians at least 4th Corinthians. If you start with 1 Corinthians 5 referencing the real 1 Corinthians, and 1 Corinthians being the 2nd Corinthians, and then there's a severe letter that he writes to the church at Corinth, which I would call 3rd Corinthians, which brings us to our 2nd Corinthians, which I would call 4th Corinthians. So let me make my case. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, you don't have to turn there. I'm just going to quickly reference these. Paul says, I determined this within myself, that I would not come again to you in sorrow. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul said, I did not want to come to you, to Corinth, again in sorrow. Now, you ask in your mind, why is he going to Acts 18? Well, I'll tell you. Look at verse 1 of Acts chapter 18. This is Paul's second missionary journey. Acts 18, this is the latter part of Paul's second missionary journey. After these things, Paul departed from Athens, that's right here, and he came to Corinth. Do you remember Acts 17, the Areopagus, and that great sermon that he preached? There were just a few people that he converted. But then he comes to Corinth, and he stayed here for how long? Well, we're about to find out. He went to Corinth. He found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Italy's kind of over here. Anyway, so he's not on the map. But because Claudius, who's Claudius? The president. Okay. Okay. Do emperors have a constituency? No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. So as a preacher, he also had another job, which was making tents. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, this area right here, they came south, and they met with Paul at Corinth. Are you with me so far? So they came to Corinth, and they met up with him. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. I think the English Standard Version says something besides compelled by the Spirit. What does the English Standard Version say? He was occupied.
Testified.
He was occupied with the Word. Okay, that really makes more sense, because that's the meaning. He was occupied with the Word. In other words, he gave up his secular work and he became a full-time preacher in Corinth. Now, how did he do that? Because we're going to later learn from the book of Philippians, which we haven't gotten there yet, but you're going to learn, he's going to say, thanks, because you sent aid to me, not once, twice. He's thanking them. Why? Because when Timothy and Silas came, they brought him money. So he gave up his tent making and go to preaching the Word. So that's what he did on a full-time basis. So that's where we are. When they opposed and blasphemed, he shook his garment and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I'm clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. He departed from there, entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. Many of the Corinthians hearing, believed, and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by vision. Do not be afraid, but speak, and do not keep silent, for I'm with you. No one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city, that city right there. And the Lord said, don't be afraid, don't give up, hang in there, keep going, because I have people for you to teach. He continued there a year and 6 months. How long is that? Year and a half. So for a year and 6 months, teaching the Word of God among them. So he's here establishing quite a work. For Paul, that's a long time. Okay. Then, of course, Gallio, the Jews, they rose up against Paul. He had to leave. And so, verse 18, he remained a good while, but then he sailed from there for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea. He came to this little town here to get his hair cut, like mine, because he wanted to be, don't answer that. So, he came from Corinth to Cenchrea. And then he says, verse 21 of Acts 18, he took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. That's where he's headed. He's all the way over here to get his hair cut, but he's going here to Jerusalem. Probably going to be grown by the time he gets there, but when he's leaving Cenchrea, he's going to Jerusalem. But I will return again to you, God willing, and he sailed from Ephesus. See, he stayed here for just a little while, went to the synagogue there, and preached there for just a little while. They wanted him to stay longer, but he said, I'll come back. And so he left Ephesus, and he heads off down here to Jerusalem to keep the feast. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and greeted the church, boom, boom, this is where he went. He came from here down to Caesarea rather, to Jerusalem. Okay, this is verse 22. And going up and greeted the church, he went down to Antioch. Elevation-wise, he's going down to Antioch. After he had spent some time there, how long, we don't know, he departed and went over the region of Galatia, this area right here. So, this is the beginning of his third missionary journey. Verse 23, Paul begins his third missionary journey. Are you with me? Am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? You are wondering, what in the world? Stay with me. So, okay, he comes through here and he preaches. Now, one thing we didn't do, and I'm not going to do it tonight, but in Acts 15, which we will get to that hopefully in time, there was a meeting. It was here in Jerusalem. There was a meeting to decide the question about circumcision and whether or not it should be binding and obligatory, whether we should continue preaching it or insisting on it. And it was decided, no, we're not going to do that. All these Gentile churches around here, we're not going to insist that they be circumcised. It had nothing to do with the gospel. We're not going to do it. And they wrote a letter. The actual first epistle we know anything about is contained in Acts 15. And Paul took that letter and he carried it here. Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. And said that's where he took it. Among other places that he had been, but he took it there. And he preached on that third journey these things. Now look where he went. As he went through here, he comes over by Hierapolis and he stops right here in Ephesus. And so when you get to Acts 19, Paul came to Ephesus and he began a work. Now we're not going to have time to read all of Acts 19, but he had a powerful work. A lot of people were being converted. In fact, so many people were being converted that a riot broke out. That seems crazy, but whenever the gospel is really having good success, that's when the enemy gets really upset and starts doing what he does. And so there was an uproar, beginning in verse 21. But look at verse 21 of Acts 19. When these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit while he passed through Macedonia. He left Ephesus. He's getting ready to. That's what he's getting ready to do. Okay? Going to pass through Macedonia and Achaia. So he's already planning to go here. To go to Jerusalem, saying, after I've been there, I must see also Rome, which is over here. Okay? So he sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus. So he's still here, but he sent Timothy ahead of him. Okay, but he himself stayed in Asia, specifically Ephesus, for a while. And that's when the uproar broke out. Paul had to escape again for his life. So again, as he escaped for his life, he goes north to this place called Troas. And while he's at Troas, we're going to find out in a minute, he was waiting for someone. He didn't show up, but there was a door of opportunity for him to preach the gospel while he's there. But he didn't take advantage of that opportunity because he was too disturbed in spirit. What was he disturbed about? Well, he's waiting for Titus to come back from Corinth. And why is Titus in Corinth? We're going to find out in a minute. But he goes from Troas and he comes probably to Philippi in this area. And that's where Titus comes and meets him. You with me? Okay, Paul said, I'm not going to come to you again in sorrow. Now, when you look at that ministry in Acts 18, he stayed there a year and a half. When he first came there, did he come there in sorrow? Well, if he did, there's no indication. Did he experience opposition while he was there? Of course he did. He experienced opposition everywhere he went, from the same group of people, everywhere he went. Jews. They didn't like what he was doing. But even though he faced opposition, he converted a lot of Jews while he was at Corinth. We just read about that in Acts 18. But notice what he said here in 2 Corinthians 2. I determined I'm not going to come to you again in sorrow. I don't get that in Acts 18. Now maybe you do. Maybe you say, well, he probably was very sorrowful to have to start a new church in Corinth. I don't think that Paul went to establish the church sorrowfully. I don't think he did that. Now, he might have established the church and problems would arise later that would upset and disturb him, and so he might go back to that church in sorrow. That might happen, which I believe is what did happen. But I don't believe he went there to establish the church, stayed there for 18 months in sorrow. I don't believe that's what happened. That's not indicated in Acts 18. Are you with me? That's the first plank in my argument. All right, here's the second. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 14. Now for the third time, I'm ready to come to you. Now we just read Acts 18. And we saw where he was here, and he left there and got a haircut in Cenchrea, and then he comes back over here to Caesarea, and then Jerusalem, and back to Antioch. So, where was that second time to Corinth? Where was it? Because he'd already been there twice. He said, that's what he's saying here. I'm ready to come the third time, and I will not be burdensome to you, for I do not seek yours, but you, for the children ought not lay for the parent for the children. Now in chapter 13 of 2 Corinthians, verse 1, he said categorically, this third time I'm coming to you. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. What is that reference? He's clearly been there twice. We didn't read that in Acts 18. We didn't read it in Acts 19. So, where did this happen? I mean, anyway, I told you before, verse 2 of 2 Corinthians 13, I told you before and foretell as if I were present the second time, and now being absent, I write to those who have sinned before and to all the rest, that if I come again, I will not spare, since you seek a proof of Christ speaking in me, who is not weak toward you, but mighty in you. Okay, this is my theory. I'm going to just tell you, and then I'm going to try to break it down. Paul's here for 18 months on his third missionary journey. Oh, no, actually, he was there longer than that. How long was he at Ephesus? Do you remember? It was about 18 months, wasn't it? Again. Acts 9, somebody help me with that. Acts 19. How long was he there?
2 years.
About 2 years, wasn't it? Yeah, in fact, reading the school of Tyrannus. Yeah, verse 10 of Acts 19. This continued for 2 years, so he's there a little longer than he was at Corinth. So he's spending quite a bit of time here at Ephesus. He had a good work there. Okay? I'm just going to break it down and then I'm going to share with you what I'm saying. While he's having this great work at Ephesus, word comes across the sea to him from Corinth. There's trouble brewing in the church at Corinth. And that trouble had to do with you, Paul. Someone's questioning you. Someone's questioning your authority. Someone's questioning your credibility. Someone's questioning your gospel. Everything that you've done here is in jeopardy. So, Paul writes a letter. Or, this is what's unclear. Either he just got on a boat and shot over here for the second time, and while he's there at Corinth, he's confronting this group that's amassing itself against him, this Jewish element in the church, who now has a ringleader in its midst. And this ringleader is leading this opposition against Paul, and he goes and challenges him with no success. He didn't solve the issue. He had to go back to Ephesus to finish his good work here, so he just couldn't get everybody's feathers back in order. Everything's up. It's still dust is in the air. So he comes back to Ephesus, and it may be that this is when he wrote that third letter. Or maybe he wrote the third letter and then made a journey. I don't know which it is. I can't give you the order on that. But my point is, he wrote a letter, which I'm going to call a severe letter. A letter that he regretted writing. At least for a period of time. I don't believe he regretted writing 1 Corinthians. But there was some letter he wrote that he regretted writing, at least for a period of time. And he makes a trip over here at least a second time. And it probably was no doubt during his stay at Ephesus. In fact, the timeline suggests it had to be while he's at Ephesus. He comes over here, confronts this guy, whoever he was. He was a Jew of some kind, probably pretending to be an apostle, claiming to be an apostle. Why would I make such a statement like that? What does 2 Corinthians 11 talk about? Such are false apostles, deceitful workers. So he probably saying, I've come from Jerusalem, I'm telling you, this Paul guy, he didn't know what he's talking about. He got the gospel all wrong. You only start circumcising all these people. He tearing the church apart. Probably in a Bible class, creating some controversy or something. I don't know. But Paul's trying to deal with it and doesn't. So he sends his letter. But then he sends Titus with that letter. But before he can get an answer, a riot erupts in Ephesus. And he had to leave town. And so he sends word, tell Titus to meet me here at Troas. And that's where he hoped to meet him. But when he came to Troas, he didn't find him there. He had an opportunity to preach the gospel, but because Titus didn't show up, he just kept going north. Because he just couldn't wait. And so Titus comes north and meets him. And that's where he gets word, and that's when he wrote 4 Corinthians and sent it to Corinth. Now, that's my view. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 5. The traditional view, probably the most popular view, 2 Corinthians 2, verse 5 beginning, is a reference to 1 Corinthians 5 and a fornicating brother that had to be withdrawn from. That's very plausible, highly possible. But it's also possible it's a reference to someone else. Either way, the message is the same. Look at verse 5 of chapter 2. If anyone has caused grief, he's not grieved me, but all of you to some extent, not to be too severe. This punishment which was inflicted by the majority is sufficient for such a man. So that, on the contrary, you ought rather to forgive and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one be swallowed up with too much sorrow. Therefore, I urge you to reaffirm your love to him, for to this end I also wrote, that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. Now, to whom you forgive anything, I also forgive. For if indeed I have forgiven anything, I have forgiven that one for your sakes in the presence of Christ, lest Satan should take an advantage of us, if we're not ignorant of his devices. Does this sound like Paul is dealing with someone he's never met, he's only heard about, who was sleeping with his father's wife? Possibly. But it sounds to me like Paul knew the guy, had some personal interaction with the guy. And Paul's simply saying, it's okay. I'm not going to be hurt or disturbed. And I appreciate what you did, the majority of you. And so now that he's repented, y'all forgive him. That's my view. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 7. Of the case, y'all hang with me. The case is going to get better. I know you think I'm crazy, but I'm going to stick with me. chapter 10, verse 7. Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ's, let him consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so are we Christ. What is that? What is he talking about? Someone's over here saying, hey, I got the true gospel, and I'm a true Christian. Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. That's a summary of what he's saying. Paul said, if he thinks he's a Christian, well, I'm a Christian too. That's the gist of what he's saying here. Verse 8, for even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. It's wonderful to be a preacher. People say wonderful things about you all the time. Let such a person consider this. He keeps going back to a person. In his mind, there's somebody that's stirring this pot. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, we will also be in deed. So you think, oh man, his letters are really tough sounding, but he's nothing in real life. Not a very good speaker. Not good to look at either. I don't know. Chapter 7, verse 12. This is a very important verse. Chapter 7, verse 12, 2 Corinthians. Therefore, although I wrote to you, I did not do it for the sake of him who had done the wrong, nor for the sake of him who suffered wrong, but that our care for you in the sight of God might appear to you. Now, when you read 1 Corinthians, you get the impression that he's writing a letter to single a particular individual out. He did in chapter 5, but he dealt with a lot of issues in 1 Corinthians. It doesn't sound like the kind of letter that you would speak about writing about a particular person. There was a particular person in mind. So again, the argument could be made. He's talking about the fornicator of chapter 5, perhaps. But he said, I didn't write that letter for the sake of the one who had done the wrong. What wrong? Fornication, or was it church squabbling and questioning Paul's authority? Which was it? Chapter 2, verse 3 of 2 Corinthians. Chapter 2, verse 3. I wrote this very thing to you, lest when I came I should have sorrow over those from whom I ought to have joy, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you. Again, you might take the view that when he wrote 1 Corinthians, he wrote it with many tears. Perhaps. I don't get that impression. It doesn't come through to me when I read 1 Corinthians. I've read it many times. I mean, he's strong about some things. He deals point blank with some things, but I don't get the impression from reading 1 Corinthians that he's writing it in tears. Now, again, he's a preacher, and so anytime you're having to deal with these sensitive subjects, you might say, well, I'm writing in tears. It just, to me, doesn't fit. Not what he's describing here. I wrote a letter to you with a lot of tears. I'm very upset about it. Chapter 7 again, verse 5. He says, indeed, when we came to Macedonia, this area right in here, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts, inside were fears. Nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. Coming where? Right here. To Philippi, probably, in this area of Macedonia. And not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was comforted in you, when he told us of your earnest desire, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice even more. For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. I don't see Paul writing anything in 1 Corinthians that he could say, honestly, I regret writing. I just don't see that. For I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a while. In fact, I don't see Paul saying, any inspired letter he would have written, he wrote with regret, even for a brief period of time. That's just my opinion. But I just don't see Paul doing that, or describing writing an inspired letter that way. I don't care how tough the subject is. I don't see Paul saying about the church of Galatia, which we'll talk about later. I don't hear him saying later, I really regret having to write those churches those harsh words. I mean, there were pretty harsh words in Galatia. I mean, pretty harsh. But I don't see Paul saying, I regret writing it. Why would Paul regret writing anything in 1 Corinthians? Now, if there was a third letter that we don't have, that was more personal in nature, where he's defending himself, he might have said some stuff pretty harsh there. It may not have been inspired. It may have just been a personal communication from this man to that church, and I'm sorry that I wrote it. Although, not really. For I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a while. Does any of that make sense to you? Did you keep up with me at all? Be honest. Okay, Lester says no. I think Lester is being truthful. So we have Paul left Ephesus for 2 years. He gets word there's some problems brewing in Corinth, so he comes over here to confront that problem. While he's there, there's a ringleader that's probably insulting him, belittling him, questioning his authority as an apostle, probably claiming to be an apostle himself. Paul didn't have time to resolve these. He had to go back to Ephesus. While he's here, he fires off a letter that he later regrets writing. But before he can get a response from Titus, who he sent it with, he comes north to Troas. While he's at Troas, there was a door of opportunity to him. Now, chapter 2, verse 13. Paul said, I had no rest in my spirit because I found not Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went from thence into Macedonia. Taking my leave from who? If you look at the context, he's here at Troas. And so he's waiting for him there, and he didn't show up. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. So, I'm reading this passage to you because this is where Paul is when he's writing 2 Corinthians. He's here. And he's writing this letter to Corinth. Chapter 9, verse 2. I know the forwardness of your mind, for I boast to them, of Macedonia. He's bragging to these brethren about these people are really liberal givers. And they've made a dedication a year ago. They're going to give a great contribution to help these people over here. And I've been bragging to these people over here about it in Macedonia. You're ready a year ago. Your zeal has provoked them. And they gave out of what kind of giving? They gave out of deep poverty. Because they heard about what the Corinthians were planning to do. So Paul said, I'm bringing some of these people with me, so when I get there, make sure you have it collected and ready, and you give generously like you said you would, because I don't want to be embarrassed. I'm paraphrasing, but that's in essence what he said. I don't want to be embarrassed when I get there, and these guys come with me, and they say, that's all you got? I mean, that's the gist of what he was saying to them. And that's the message he was trying to get across. So, when you read 2 Corinthians, he spends a great deal of time defending himself. I like 2 Corinthians. It's one of my favorite epistles of Paul's. And we haven't had time to get into that. But some of Paul's personality, in fact, a lot of Paul's personality comes out in 2 Corinthians. And I find it fascinating and insightful because you learn something about who he was. I know he was a Jew, but I think he had some Irish blood in him somewhere. He was sarcastic to the point of being funny at times. He just said things that were just intended, to get their attention. But he was brutal with them, and he was gentle with them. He was all over the map. But it's important to remember when he's writing this, there was still a holdout group, a minority at this point. They're losing ground. They were gaining the ascendancy, but now after his letter, after his visit, after Titus had worked with them, that group is dying down, and the majority is now coming back, and they're siding with Paul. Now, why would a Jew come here and pretend to be Satan, well, that's what Paul said, yeah. Because Satan parades as a minister of light.
Because he saw what kind of attention Paul was getting.
You saw the kind of attention Paul was getting? Okay.
To regain power.
Maybe.
Undermine.
What's that?
Undermine.
To undermine. Why would you want to undermine Paul? I mean, we look at Paul and say, he's doing a great work, but you got to be a Jew of the first century world to try to understand how they saw this man. I mean, after this council meeting in Acts 15, which we didn't look at tonight, we'll do that when we get to Galatians. But he's had this meeting here in Jerusalem, and they've made a decision. This is after what we just read in Jonathan's class on Sunday morning about the first Gentile converts coming into the church, uncircumcised Gentiles coming in the church. That was a big deal to these Jews. They just couldn't get their minds around that. How could God allow uncircumcised people to be on the same level with me? It just can't happen. They've got to be circumcised, otherwise they're not even human. That's how they thought of Gentiles. And so here's this Paul, had been a ringleader of the Jews, was there consenting to the stoning death of Stephen. He was one of them. He was the leader among them. Now all of a sudden, he's leading, in their view, the opposition. But even the Christian Jews continued to struggle. Just like Peter. Rise, Peter, kill and eat. What did Peter say in Acts 10? Not so, Lord. I've never done anything like that. That mindset dominated Jews everywhere. I've never countenanced the idea that I'm going to sit in the pew next to a guy that's uncircumcised and worship God with him. That's crazy. I won't even walk out in the yard without coming in the house and washing my feet off because I'm going to have some Gentile germs on me. That's what they thought about non-Jews. And so here you got this Paul going around all over the place. And they're trying to fix what they think Paul is messing up. Now, if you're going to fix what Paul's messing up, you got to first of all make Paul unbelievable. And how do you do that? You say, Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. He misunderstood the gospel. He got it wrong. And so we're here to straighten him out. I'm not telling you the whole argument because we're going to deal more specifically with that when we get to Galatians. Because in 2 Corinthians and Galatians, as well as in Romans, he's dealing with pretty much the same topic. Yes?
In Antioch, Syria.
Okay, Antioch, Syria.
Where you were.
Yes, right here. You've been here?
Yes. There's a cave outside the city that the tourist guide told us the Apostle Paul allegedly preached in the church that met in this cave. There's a podium about like the one you're behind now, also there. The cave is about the same size as Cave Spring, Georgia, first opened, if you've ever been there.
Yeah.
Relatively small. But all the preachers in the group wanted to go up, stand behind that podium, and have the picture made where Paul preached.
Yeah.
And I just decided while I was there, I don't think that podium lasted 2,000 years.
Was it a wood podium?
That's what Paul preached behind. But it probably was where he had preached in the same cave.
Could have been. That's pretty neat. This was a very influential church. In fact, you might argue it was on par with Jerusalem in the sense that here we have the Jewish group, but we've got the Gentile group from here in that sense. Now you've got a mix in both churches pretty much except here, but mix here, Jews and Gentiles and Hellenists, but they became the home base of operations for Paul throughout that region. Very important. You notice that every time Paul finished the journey, he'd come back here and make his report. He had some kind of PowerPoint thing that worked. In fact, I think their picture was not offset. It was probably centered when he gave his slideshow. But anyway, that was Paul's home base. And I hope that something I said tonight made a little sense to you. But maybe next week we'll touch on some points in 2 Corinthians and then get into Galatians immediately from there. By the way, the elders have been rumoring that we're going to be meeting at different times over the holidays. Does that include the Thanksgiving week, or is that just Christmas and New Year's? Okay, Christmas and New Year's. Okay. Christmas and New Year's both fall on Wednesday. And so the week of Christmas, we're going to be meeting on Thursday, not Tuesday, but Thursday. And then on New Year's, Tuesday, we're going to.
Come by yourself.
That means you have to stay up. Well, some of y'all will be singing in the New Year on that Tuesday. Okay. So, Tuesday for New Year's Eve and Thursday for Christmas set. Okay. All right. Well, they killed Abel. What? What's your song? 291 in your songbook, please. Elders and deacons meet this Sunday at 8 o'clock. That's the 17th, is that correct? Also, the widowhood luncheon will be the 20th, next Wednesday at 11:30. Don't forget the Friday night fellowship, not this Friday, but Friday week. That's not this Friday, but the next. We'll be having snacks, games, and at time to go to bed. That's around 6 o'clock Friday evening, right? Okay. That's 2 nights I have to go beyond my bedtime. Friday week. What? That's the 22nd of November. My mother-in-law, who's not here tonight, had a birthday yesterday. My granddaughter had a birthday yesterday. So we'll have to sing happy birthday to them. Somebody go. You gonna lead a happy birthday song? Do you know how?
I don't think so.
You don't know how? Harmon, you gonna lead a birthday song? Thank you. My sister Lynn has a birthday this month. Huh? I was going to say the 18th because I was going to impress you, but then Mama said it out loud. I mentioned, and it was mentioned in our prayer at the beginning of the service, that, and I don't know how to describe this, but a horrible, horrible tragedy that had befallen the Skinner family from the Bremen congregation. A 4-year-old was riding on a tractor and fell off the tractor and was killed. And the funeral will be tomorrow at the Bremen church at 1 o'clock. Unfortunately, this is not the only time that a small child riding a tractor has fallen off and been killed. Probably not something you want to do. Yes? You had a comment, question?
The service is actually at 2 o'clock.
At 2 o'clock, okay.
Yeah.
It was listed as 1 o'clock central on the obit, and I
Oh,
didn't realize
okay.
that.
Thank you for that clarification. 2 o'clock at Bremen, real time. All right. Angela Tyson asked us to remember her this week as she travels to Texas. I said she will not be able to be with us Sunday, I don't believe, because she'll be there to take care of her mother's remains. Her mother has passed away. Also, Eula, her grandmother, and our sister continues in the hospital at Carrollton. Charles Lummis continues in our prayers, and I have learned this week has lung cancer. Al Gaddis continues with shingles at home. Betty Denmark, I haven't heard from her this week. I tried to call her and did not get an answer. Does anybody know about Betty? An update? Yes, ma'am?
She's still very weak, so.
Is she recovering at home, though? I'm very glad to know she's at least not as bad off as we thought she was. My daughter Lydia and her family are at home with some kind of stomach bug, and apparently that stuff is going around, and I pray that no one else gets it, and I pray that they get better soon. Anyone else I need to mention on our prayer list?
One of my coworkers' sisters had a bleed in her brain, and she's in ICU.
Do you have a name?
I don't have her name, I don't have her sister's, Nicole is my coworker, and I don't know her sister's name.
Certainly want to pray for all those that are hurting right now. That's terrible. How old is this person, you know?
Probably in her thirties, maybe.
That's terrible.
I
I'm
think
sorry to
she's
hear
her
that.
older sister, so.
And your song again?
291.
291. We're going to be singing the song of invitation that's just been announced. It's good to be here tonight. Good to be with you. Good to share this time in Bible study and fellowship. As we traditionally do at the end of our services, we offer an invitation. The invitation of the Lord is open 24/7. But while we're here, while we're present to encourage one another, especially in this song, it is a good time for those who need to respond to heaven's invitation, to obey the gospel, or to ask for the prayers of the church, to be restored to your first love, whatever your need might be. If we can assist you in any way, please don't hesitate to make that need known while together we stand as we sing.
What can wash away